Somewhere, tens of thousands of years ago, a teenage girl looked down and saw blood. She had no idea what it was. No one had explained it to her, and there was no one to call. Here's the thing. This happened to basically every woman who ever lived. That makes it one of the most universal experiences in human history. And it's also one of the least talked about, barely mentioned in most history books. So let's actually talk about it. First, a quick biology detour, because it explains everything else. Puberty isn't just growing up. From an evolutionary standpoint, your body is running a constant calculation. Do I have enough resources to support a pregnancy? Researcher Rose Frisch proposed this in the early 1970s. A girl's body, she argued, needs to cross a minimum threshold of body fat roughly 17% before menstruation can even begin. Later research refined those numbers and challenged parts of the theory, but the core idea has held up remarkably well. Puberty isn't just about age, it's about energy. Years later, scientists identified a biological messenger that helps explain why. It's called leptin, a hormone released by fat cells that essentially reports back to the brain on how much stored energy the body is carrying. Enough leptin, and the body gets the green light to start the reproductive machinery. Not enough, and it waits. Your body, in other words, checks its own fuel gauge before deciding reproduction is worth the risk. Which raises an interesting question. If puberty is about energy, when did it actually happen for a prehistoric teenager? Later than you'd probably guess. In modern, well-fed populations, the average age of a first period is around 12 or 13. But researchers who studied hunter-gatherer societies found something very different. Anthropologist Nancy Howell spent years studying the Kungsan people of the Kalahari, a population still living a traditional, foraging lifestyle well into the 20th century. She found menarche happening much later, closer to 16 years old. Harder physical activity played a role, so did leaner diets and the sheer number of calories burned simply surviving day to day. It's a reasonable, evidence-based assumption that prehistoric girls followed a similar pattern, later, not earlier, thanking what's considered normal today. So picture that 16-year-old, deep in prehistory, experiencing this for the first time. And here's where I have to be honest with you. We do not know what she thought. Nobody wrote it down. There's no journal, no cave painting captioned, day one. Extremely confused. Anyone who claims to know her exact reaction is simply guessing. What we can do is look at traditional societies, much more recent ones, but still outside industrial culture. Anthropologists have spent decades recording how menarche gets handled around the world, and the pattern is strikingly consistent. Across many unrelated cultures, on different continents, with no contact with one another, first menstruation isn't hidden, it's marked. Take that same Kung population Nancy Howell studied. When a girl gets her first period, she's secluded in a hut, while the rest of the community performs what's called the eland bull dance, women mimicking the movements of an eland cow in a ritual meant to bring her beauty and protection. Thousands of miles away, the Apache marked the same moment with the sunrise ceremony, a multi-day celebration involving the whole community. In West Africa, among the Akan people, it's called Bragoro, and it formally announces that a girl is ready to be recognized as a woman. Different continents, completely different rituals, but the same underlying idea. This is significant, not shameful. Did prehistoric humans handle it the same way? We genuinely can't say for certain, but it does suggest something important. Treating periods as an unspeakable secret looks a lot more like a modern habit than a universal human one. Now, here's the frustrating part for archaeologists. Figuring out how prehistoric women actually managed the practical side of this is incredibly hard, for a very unglamorous reason. Whatever they used, plant material, soft hides, moss, anything absorbent, it was organic. And organic material rots. It doesn't fossilize. It doesn't survive thousands of years buried in soil. It doesn't show up neatly labeled in an archaeological dig. So, if you've ever heard someone confidently claim exactly what cave women used, period, full stop, that claim isn't coming from a preserved artifact. There isn't one. What we do have are hypotheses, reasonable, evidence-informed guesses built from materials we know were available and commonly used for other purposes. Moss, soft plant fibers, prepared animal hides. These materials were already part of daily life, used for wound care and general everyday use, so it's a logical inference that they were pressed into service here too. Logical doesn't mean proven though. Any honest historian will tell you the direct evidence simply hasn't survived. Once we hit actual written history, the picture gets dramatically clear, because now people were writing things down. The oldest known women's health document is the Kahun Gynecological Papyrus from ancient Egypt, dating back to around 1800 BCE. It addresses fertility, pregnancy, contraception, and gynecological complaints in careful, methodical detail. A few centuries later came the Ebers Papyrus from around 1550 BCE, which devotes an entire section specifically to remedies for women. Egyptian medicine, in other words, already treated menstrual and reproductive health as legitimate medicine, worth writing an entire scroll about 3,500 years ago. Here's a detail that trips up a lot of viral history posts though. The Ebers Papyrus does describe a linen tampon-like object meant to be inserted into the body. But historians who study it closely are clear that it wasn't for absorbing routine monthly blood. It was a treatment for a specific medical condition. It's a good example of how a real ancient artifact gets flattened into a much simpler catch-your myth once it travels far enough from the original source. The Greeks and Romans took written medicine even further. A physician named Soranus of Ephesus, practicing in Rome in the late 1st or early 2nd century CE, produced a detailed 4-volume text simply called Gynecology. It covered menstruation and anatomy, contraception and childbirth, all in careful, methodical detail, and it remained a major medical reference for well over 1,000 years afterward. He even discussed rest and gentle care for unusually painful periods. Advice that honestly sounds pretty familiar, even now. But medicine wasn't the only thing being written about periods at the time. At almost exactly the same moment, Soranus was practicing careful, methodical gynecology. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder was publishing something very different. In his sprawling encyclopedia, Natural History, Pliny claimed a menstruating woman could turn wine sour with a touch, kill entire hives of bees, and strip the shine from a mirror without even making contact. He wrote that her presence alone could blunt a sharpened blade and rust bronze and iron. Dogs, he insisted, would be driven into a rabid frenzy if they so much as tasted it. So, in the exact same era, in the exact same empire, you had one physician carefully documenting menstrual health with genuine clinical seriousness, and one of Rome's most widely read writers insisting period blood was basically a weapon of mass destruction. Both of those ideas existed in the same society at the same time. Careful science sitting right next to wild superstition. That's honestly a pretty good summary of how humans have treated this topic for most of recorded history. Medical text, real historical detail, going back thousands of years. But actual physical menstrual products from antiquity are still almost non-existent in the archaeological record, for the exact same reason as before. Cloth and plant fiber don't survive. When you trace viral fun facts about ancient period products back to their original source, that source usually turns out to be shaky at best. Which brings us to a genuinely wild final fact. The convenient products most people use today are almost shockingly recent. The very first commercially sold pad was called Lister's Towels. It launched in 1896, made by Johnson & Johnson, and it flopped. Victorian-era society considered it too shameful to advertise, or even to discuss openly in stores. Women were embarrassed to be seen buying a product that announced to the world they were menstruating. It took a war to change that. During the First World War, nurses noticed that leftover cellulose wound dressings absorbed blood far more effectively than cloth ever had. That accidental discovery kickstarted the entire sanitary pad industry, leading to Kotex reaching shelves in the years right after the war. And even then, the marketing stayed deliberately vague. Early advertisements avoided the word menstruation entirely, hiding behind phrases like feminine hygiene instead. Johnson & Johnson even quietly renamed their own failed product to something almost meaninglessly vague, Nupak, just to put distance between it and the stigma. The silence wasn't just cultural. It was baked directly into the advertising. The tampon with a modern applicator wasn't even patented until 1931 by an osteopathic physician named Dr. Earl Haas, who got the idea after watching the women in his life struggle with bulky, uncomfortable pads. He couldn't get a manufacturer interested, so he sold the patent to a businesswoman named Gertrude Tenderich, who built it into the company we now know as Tampax. It didn't reach store shelves under that name until the mid-1930s. Even the menstrual cup, which feels like a distinctly modern, eco-friendly invention, isn't as new as you'd think. An actress named Leona Chalmers patented the first commercially sold rubber menstrual cup in 1937, the very same year Tampax was hitting the market. Two completely different products, born within months of each other, after hundreds of thousands of years of women managing this with whatever they had on hand. Let that sink in for a second. Humans have been menstruating for the entire existence of our species, hundreds of thousands of years, and the products treated today as completely unremarkable. The ones sitting in your bathroom cabinet right now are barely a century old. For nearly all of human history, women simply figured it out themselves, generation after generation, using whatever was actually available, with essentially no instructions, no products, and for most of that history, almost total silence about the whole thing, which honestly makes it one of the most quietly impressive threads running through the entire story of being human. Every single person watching this exists because that system worked, generation after generation, in near total silence, without a single instruction manual, for longer than writing itself has existed. So here's a question for you. Of everything in this video, what surprised you the most? The prehistoric age of first periods, the wild Roman superstitions, or just how recent pads and tampons actually are? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. And if you want more deep dives like this into the hidden history of everyday things, subscribe, because there's a lot more where this came from.